You're listening to the Hello World podcast, number 28. My name is Sean Wildemuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Today on the show, I have Rachel Appel. Rachel is a 20-plus year consultant, author, mentor, and former Microsoft employee in the IT industry who speaks at top industry conferences such as VSLive, DevConnections, Mix, and more. During her career, Rachel has worked on projects from all sizes, from the smallest apps to the largest enterprise systems at some of the world's leading companies. Rachel and I have known each other for quite a while now, and she's always great for a good conversation, both about the insides of when she was a Microsoft employee, as well as her overall knowledge of the industry. Today we get to talk to Rachel about what it's like running your own consulting business in a small town in Pennsylvania, and how that was different from when she was in New York when she worked for Microsoft. I think you'll enjoy this one. Let's take a listen. Today I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Appel to the show. How are you doing, Rachel?
Doing well, Sean. And yourself?
I'm good. And you're in Philly these days, is that correct?
Yeah, well, sort of. In the northeast Pennsylvania area, which is about like an hour and a half north of Philly. So I've retreated to the sticks over the summer.
Wow. Wow. And has summer actually arrived there, or?
That's the crux of the issue. It's starting to warm up, but I was pretty sure there that it was just going to stay in perpetual winter, and I'm still not convinced.
I'm sure you're not. So I've always been curious about this question. When you were sued by Apple to change your name because of the whole copyright thing, how did that go? Do I have that story wrong?
A little bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I often hear about the person whose name was Mike Rowe, and he started Micro Software. Yeah, it's kind of like that kind of an urban legend. So.
That's funny.
It is fun though when you work for Microsoft with such a last name because obvious.
Obvious, yeah. So you can't be walking around with your iPhone and iPad when you were working there. Yeah,
well. Kind of did a little bit anyway, but
well, you're a little bit of the rebel anyway.
Yeah, and there's in the name of making sure you're keeping up on the competition. Somebody has to do it.
Absolutely. At least that's a good story. So the sort of the crux of the show is I'm curious about how people got started. Did they have a computer when they were a kid? Did they get started in college? Did they accidentally get into development when they were in their 40s? I mean, what is your story?
Yeah, so I'm kind of a bit of a lifer. As a child, I was really drawn to things like biology and stuff like that. And then my father, oddly enough, actually was a teacher at a vocational technical high school, and he taught welding, of all things. So, of course, kids, we all learned welding, right, as a kid. And the school would get, every once in a while, they'd get a little extra budget money, and they bought a computer for each classroom. There was also 2 computing classrooms as well, but they bought one for all the non-computing classrooms. And so one day, they buy these things, and then what do you do? So over the summer, he'd bring them home. So he brought home a TRS-80, and he brought home an Apple IIe, and nobody else, to the rest of the family, it was just a giant paperweight. They just, no idea, no interest at all, except for me. I could sit there for hours and hours on these things, and especially on the Apple IIe. There was the 20 questions, which is kind of a canonical AI program.
Interesting. I've never heard of the 20 questions before.
So, there's other names for it, but basically I would say, hey, I'm thinking of something and you need to guess, and you have 20 questions to ask. And you might say, is it animal, vegetable, or mineral? And I might say animal. And then you'd say, well, is it soft and furry? And I might say yes. And you'd say, well, then is it a kitten? And I might say no. And you'd say, okay, well, it's soft and furry. What else is soft and furry? So then, is it a camel? No. And I don't really know how really soft and furry they are. But then you might come to, dog. Yes, it is. So after so many questions, you might be able to get it. So the computer is kind of, in a way, teaching itself by tracking all these questions that it has asked and answered and trying to find an appropriate answer by guessing. And it's basically kind of the same logic that humans would use. So I was just fascinated with this, and I could go on for hours with this thing, just playing the game and then going in and looking at the source for it. And it was all text-based. It was all green screen. There was no graphics. There was no web, nothing. And all you got was the manual that came in the box. And that was pretty much it. Like even a trip to Barnes & Noble didn't really have a computer section like they did for a long time. Once you got to the .com boom and all that, it was really hard to find manuals to work with this stuff.
Interesting. And was this 20 questions written in Apple Basic or?
Actually, yeah, there's an AppleSoft Basic, and there was one for the TRS too that was in, I think, GW Basic or something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this would have been, like the late 70s, early 80s and stuff like that. And then, of course, that kind of started the whole thing, but then I would try to computerize everything possible that I could. I was like the littlest automator as a kid. Anything that you can document, I was trying to document it and trying to store data and, very primitive forms of databases and stuff like that back then.
And did you have a lot of encouragement at school, or was it more your father, or were there other kids or teachers at school that were sort of showing you stuff?
Nope, not really anything at school when I was that young and playing with these couple of machines. I went to a small school, and there just wasn't any budget for that at that school or anything like that. It wasn't until I hit like 9th or 10th grade in high school that I actually went to the vocational school that my father taught at. And there is where they had two programs, and they called them data processing is what they called it back then. And when you went out to work, it was called MIS, the MIS department.
Yeah.
It wasn't even an IT department then. And so they had these two programs, scientific and business data processing. So I went to scientific data processing. And we learned how to do COBOL and RPG and things like that because they had a S36 at this school. And the school, outside of doing school stuff, they actually kept the records for all of the schools in the area. So for several different other school districts.
Interesting.
And that was all done because they were the only ones who had an S36. So they had their own little MIS department there that did all the grades for all the schools and everything like that. And the teachers would just mark them down and, send them in on paper back then, and somebody would transcribe them and put them in that central database there.
And the S36 was that one of the IBM minis, or?
Yeah, that was an old IBM mainframe, and then they upgraded to an AS400 later. And then, but the same stuff, basically, just COBOL and RPG. And I used to get to help by, being that they all knew my father and stuff. And I was actually the best one in the class. I got the best grades of everybody.
Nice.
Because I would actually get the programs to run. So there was that. It's, but yeah, so I would do above and beyond stuff. So I would help them with the backups, which were huge, like 16 millimeter reel tapes at the time. So you'd actually have to put it on a big machine and lace it up. And I did all that stuff every morning, and they would run them in the morning. And then later, because it depended on sometimes you went to school in the morning and sometimes in the afternoon, and you went half a day at this technical school and then half a day at your regular high school, which was a little bit odd, but they only had the tech facilities here, and you still needed some of the regular high school training for a high school diploma, so you'd have to do both.
Wow.
So depending on if I was morning or afternoon, they'd be like, oh, well, somebody here is willing to do the backup, and it works. So, they were kind of cool with adjusting the schedule to let the kids do stuff like that. And usually I was the only kid who wanted to. I was like, yeah, I'll do this. This is fun. Why do I liked doing these things with computers. The other kids were just kind of there because they figured we'll need them and we're going into business. That was about it.
That's
I think I was the only
interesting.
one who really wanted to do, at this point, I was like, well, I'm doing something with programming, right, for my career. I just didn't, I kind of figured you'd go back to school once or twice, and review your knowledge a little bit. And I never thought it'd be anything like it is today.
No,
Especially
you learn one skill and you would just use that.
Yeah, it's nothing like that today.
Well,
So,
I mean, your experience with COBOL and RPG, that helps you a lot in the work you're doing today, right?
actually, you would be surprised. What goes
Or
around comes
horrified.
around.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of that. And I often hear some of the younger programmers complaining of certain things. And I'm like, if you actually had to write software in COBOL, you would understand why we don't want to do these certain things a certain way today, or why reusability is so important, or certain things that you'd only see in this odd monolithic kind of language, which is basically all they had back then. Now everything's modular. It's, you have to kind of go out of your way to make a monolithic app out of something in .NET, per example.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
I've seen people do it. Yeah.
So, from high school, did you go to college for programming, or did you get started early? How did that go?
I did, but I did both. So what happened was, I actually moved out of my house pretty young. So I was out when I was about 15. So I did go to college, but I didn't have much money for it. So whatever little grants and whatnot I could get from actually, being at a tech school, they'd come across like little sciencey competitions. So you can do write a program, present on it, go up against other kids and win some money. So I did that, and that sailed me through like a year or so of Penn State. And then I was able to take, money that I had saved up or whatever for another year. And that's about as far as I got. And then the money ran out. So I tried to get some regular grants and stuff, but I just didn't have enough money to keep going.
Sure.
So what I do is I try to take all the cores for comp sci that I can.
While you were there.
While I was there. And I was also working at the time. What actually happened was in my senior year
of high school?
Of high school. Actually, the last little bit of my junior year, too, and over the summer, there would be basically what would be an internship, right? A paid internship for the kids. Mm-hmm. And they called it like a co-op program or something like that.
I was in the same sort of thing, yeah.
So actually in high school, I started working doing COBOL programming and stuff like that under course supervision of others and whatnot under these programs. So by the time I actually got to college, I was already working in it a little bit. And then I was doing both anyway. And I kind of needed to work full time because I had to pay for expenses. Yeah. So I was just going to night school on the side. So I did that for a couple of years until I ran out of money. By that time, I was kind of working in the industry. So I was kind of all right with that. And then eventually, scales tilted, and then I had enough money. And then by that time, I just didn't really want to go back and do it. I was already working long enough in the industry that I didn't need the college at that point. So
Absolutely. And how long did you stay in sort of the COBOL RPG, big iron world?
Let's see, not terribly long, only the first few years, because as new things came out, I was very excited to get to them. When DBase and Novell became a new thing, I remember the accountant reading about it in the magazine and then everybody going, yeah, this is a great idea. And then we had no idea what we were doing, but we put together some networking and got things to talk to each other and wrote some programs around it, and it seemed to work. So
yeah, those wonderful, 1 megabit networks. We were just happy that, it's only going to take 4 hours to copy a text file.
Exactly. That's so funny. Yes, I remember 640K. Yeah, Bill Gates is right. This ought to be enough for anybody.
What do you mean we don't have to actually carry a floppy down the hall? It's magic.
I did that for talking COBOL, I've done enough where I'd had to save on an 8-inch disc. So those are pretty big.
Those were amazing. And they were just like the 5 1/4s, but they're so big that you had to keep them from bending just from gravity. There was nothing.
Right.
It was that whole structure, like, you know.
That actually is floppy.
Yes.
Right? The actual floppy disk.
Absolutely. And so you got started in sort of the DBase and PC world then.
Yeah, so when I went over to PC, it was a little bit of IT work. And of course, back then I was happy to basically do anything related to computing, right? So, helping them put in Novell stuff, doing mainframe stuff, all that was fine. So yeah, DBase. And, then I started going over to the dark side of C++. And then I found myself doing Clipper at one point for a short period.
Clipper was one of my early loves. I spent a long time in Clipper. So I understand both the reticence and the fascination.
So that's what they had. I actually worked at Wise Potato Chips early in my career, and I got hired to do actually C++ and Clipper there. I hadn't done any Clipper before, but I'd done some DBase. And we actually wrote the software that goes on the handheld machines which are vastly different now, but they had those handheld scanners and stuff that they take into the stores. And then we would write the code in Clipper. Of course, on the machines, it had to be C++, but on just a PC, they would take the data from those machines and that would go into Clipper systems, right? And these would be your basic line of business systems that nobody writes anymore today because you just buy it. You just buy an ERP system or you buy CRM or something like that.
Absolutely.
Back there, or payroll or whatever it was. But, back then we were still writing this stuff. Back then projects took years, not months. The time scales were much different.
And you had to plan really carefully because making a change was expensive. It would derail you for months, not weeks or days.
Far more than it is now, and nobody heard of things like Agile. We did testing that was essentially unit testing, but nobody called it that. It was just code that you wrote to make sure that other code works, stuff like that. So things were a little bit different back then. Very, very, very much things were one giant whopping program.
And did they pay you purely in potato chips?
No, but you know what? I don't think I ate a potato chip for like another decade after I left there. Just when you're surrounded by them all day, every day, you tend to either...
They lose their fascination.
They lose their fascination when you're smelling them all day and you're just surrounded by them. I used to get I would fill up the trunk of my car for like $2 at the company store. And I would literally have the trunk of my car filled with potato chips and snacks and everything. So I'd just pull up and give them to my friends and stuff.
That is funny.
Yeah.
That is funny. So did you, as you, were sort of maturing as a developer, were there influential people at whether it was at Wise or some of the other companies that, that you looked up to or that helped, make who you are today as a developer?
I like how you think I matured. That's really great. But
more mature doesn't imply that you've reached maturity. Let me be really clear about that.
There we go. There are, of course, plenty of folks. I did a lot of, earlier on, I did a lot more cross-platform stuff, or just I did the C++ I did was Borland. It wasn't Microsoft. I did Clipper. I did all those things. Did Paradox for a while.
Wow, you're the first guest who's mentioned that the bane of my existence that was Paradox.
I actually didn't mind it, but back then there wasn't much choice.
No, they were like, here's the box of software you're going to write against. Okay.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was. It came in a little box, and that's what you did. So where were we? So who did I? So there are certainly a lot of people. when I came more into just doing mostly Microsoft stuff, it would be the days of VB. So about VB3 I picked up there. And because Paradox and whatnot was just kind of busting at the seams, and Access was starting to be a viable solution at that point. So I did a lot of VBA and VB, and then came up through the ranks that way, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then over to .NET, and then just started doing VB and C# on .NET. And then from there, mostly .NET.
Sure.
Mostly Microsoft. I did some Cold Fusion along the way there too.
My condolences.
Yes. So I did a little bit of that. So most my career has been, the bulk of it's been Microsoft with sprinkles of non-Microsoft in there, and enough so that I know that I'm not in a bubble or, just stuck, just being myopic on Microsoft.
But it sounds like almost everything you've ever done was, there was it was data driven in some ways, or is not?
Certainly. Yeah, certainly was. And because of, all this Microsoft stuff, I got a lot of Microsoft influence. So I've read, of course, like Deb Carada's books way back when, and Billy Hollis. I remember you were even writing some books, things like that. Of course, going out to the community and seeing who's doing what out there, and then kind of following what they're doing.
Was there a community that you were involved in before you stepped into sort of the Microsoft world? I mean, because that's obviously where I met you was on the road. You were doing so much community stuff, but that was after you were already into the Microsoft space.
Yeah, before Microsoft, actually, I ran a couple of just like a software user group.
Oh, cool.
Just for people to come and talk about writing software, nothing in particular, just writing, other than the fact of writing software, any language, anything. So I did that for a little bit, and then just like general computing stuff. I really, as far as community wise, other than little bits of the kind of general purpose user groups. And don't forget, a lot of this time I spent in northeastern Pennsylvania, so it's not Silicon Valley, and there's not really a lot of social little user group type things to begin with, let alone for nerd stuff. So these things usually are very sparsely populated.
So you'd have a group, and the four of you would know each other really well.
That's pretty much how a lot of it went. Yeah, just because there's not a big population here.
Sure.
But then the Microsoft community started picking up in Philly quite a bit, which is close enough for me to kind of regularly go to. So then I kind of got established in there, and then that's where I really started doing more community stuff, because there was one I could go to, and it was about these topics that I like.
Interesting. And at some point, you started being an independent instead of just having jobs. What sort of decision was that, or is that something that just sort of magically happened?
Yeah, it's a decision that I made while I was somewhat tossed off of a cliff to make it, right? So what happened was I was working at a place, and they were not doing well, and financially.
Sure.
And then a little consulting place came up and said, like, hey, do you want to come and work for us? And I said, okay. And they actually offered more money and all that stuff. Well, the other place wasn't doing well. And I thought, well, it was all during the .com boom. And I'm like, well, I just don't think you could stay at a place anymore for too long of a time, because it's too not stable.
Sure.
Right? And at the time, things really weren't. So I left, and that one place kind of crumbled. It took them a while, but it was very painful, and I had a lot of pay cuts for people. So I'm glad I didn't stay for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other one was nice for about a year, except that they just simply ran out of money, and the owner just, had too many costs. And that was basically it. And then I was like, okay, well, what I'm going to do is just run out and grab some consulting projects while I look for a full-time job. So I was still kind of stuck on I'm just going to be a full-timer.
Sure.
And I had always wanted to run out and start my own business, but I was too terrified to do so. Because like the thought of maybe not having some money coming in at any particular time was just too much. And then I took this one little, what was supposed to be a contract to hire, right? So I did that, and the person that I was kind of under was a think this person was mentally disturbed in some ways. And then finally, after like 4 months of dealing with this person, I was like, that's it. I am just going to leave and go on my own because I can't stay here. And there wasn't really a lot on the market at the time where I was looking. And I said, well, you know what? I'm going to have just as much a good a chance on my own as I am with these other options. Except now I would get to call the shots. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to at least try. And I did, and then it worked out fantastically. And then I was like, oh, shit, why didn't I do that before? So,
yeah, it's always like, oh, it wasn't as bad as I feared.
It wasn't anywhere near. As a matter of fact, it was not anywhere close. And sometimes, fear just stops you from doing things that you really should have probably been doing all the time, And
so this was still in North Pennsylvania, where it was a relatively small market. Yeah.
So, of course, I had the advantage of I'm willing to travel.
Sure.
So, of course, a lot of it I would travel to the bigger areas and whatnot. And then, of course, you get to get out and see things and all that stuff.
Of course.
So that's really what, the fact that I was willing to travel. I know a couple of consultants that were just local and they didn't, necessarily do as well just the simple fact of numbers. There's less people here where, less populated area. That's just how it's going to go.
Interesting. Yeah. I have been asked to talk at a bunch of user groups in some fairly small towns before, and I'm always fascinated by the if you decide to leave, where would you go? You've already worked at the 3 companies. Now what do you do? Do you go back to the old company? Do you move? What is the idea there? And luckily, I've always been attracted to very big cities, so it hasn't been that big of a deal. But I'm always fascinated because in these small communities, where you started, you tend to know everybody, and so when someone's looking for a job, it's less of going to the paper or these days the internet, obviously, and it's more, let me go talk to those the other 40 guys that I know that are in town, seeing if anyone's hiring.
Right.
Very insular. So, you went from how long were you an independent at this point?
Oh, so I went about 10 years as an independent, and then I went to Microsoft for about 4 years, and then now I'm back out as an independent.
And how was the working at Microsoft? You were a developer evangelist, right?
Yeah, so I was an evangelist out of the New York metro area. And it was great. I liked working at Microsoft as a whole. It's, they're a really good company. They do lots of good stuff and they build lots of great products too. People tend to think that because you work for Microsoft, you're mandated to love each and every one of their products, but that's not true. Some people choose to, but I don't like all of them. But I think that more products are great than are not. And of course, nothing's going to be perfect either for each user.
But you were
awesome experience.
And you were a fan of a lot of the Microsoft tech before then. Obviously, you were a .NET dev for a long time, and
right.
And so, did this involve you moving to New York in order to take the job?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so actually, it did. New York wasn't really on the radar for me as a place to go live because it's a little bit of a money sink living in New York. So I was like, no, and I had always lived close enough to it that you can just hop over there anytime you want.
Sure.
So there was that. But then when they, dangled this job and stuff, and I was like, oh, that's cool. And it would be fun to go work for Microsoft for a while. Why not? So I did. And that was, of course, fun. And it was basically doing all the stuff that I did before as a Microsoft MVP, except now that they actually pay you to be an MVP. So it's the job of being an MVP. And so sometimes I would just call myself a professional conference goer, things like that, because you would, you're paying to work the circuit to show up and represent the company and talk to people and answer their questions and get them their technical help they need and all that good stuff. But that's fun to do that. So.
Yeah. And so did you move from relatively small town Pennsylvania to New York, or did you stop in Philly before then so that you were ready for sort of big city living?
Well, from the travel, I had been in enough big cities anyway, but I actually did live in Dallas, Texas for a short time.
Oh, interesting.
So there's that, if you want to call that. That's an interesting big city in that it seems that they roll up the sidewalks a little early. But then again, if you compare it to New York, almost everybody does, I suppose.
In some ways. Dallas is at least my impression was always, it's a very new city. So they don't know, it's almost like they're not used to being a city of their size because That's
a good way to put it, because there is a little bit of that. It's like right in the very downtown part, it gets really quiet after working hours. And there's a few big cities that do that too. And it always makes me giggle. New York is not one of those.
No, it is, I think someone may have said that it's a city that doesn't sleep or
something like that.
Funny. So, how do you think that the time you spent at Microsoft affected how you do software development now? Because you're back at being an independent, and I assume working on projects and that sort of thing.
So it's interesting. Being at Microsoft, I noticed that there's still when you're there, you're writing the software that lets other people write software. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking to developers there's a lot of them that tend to do some of that lower level code, like C++, as a thing. And they tend to forget that the vast majority of developers are just, CRUD devs, and they're doing forms over data, and you don't really need C++ for that.
Right.
You can use any high-level general-purpose language for that kind of thing. So little things like that have, I kind of notice these things a little bit more now, when you can tell what kind of background people had. If they never really did much managed code, they're oddly not going to like it. Which is kind of weird, because I'm like, if you actually wrote in this for a couple of weeks, I think you might dump the other way of doing it, because it does so much for you. Certain things like that. And of course, you get a little bit of the Microsoft way, a little bit of the, here, have a sip of the Kool-Aid.
Sure.
Kind of seeps in there. So.
Well, there's certainly that piece of. Yeah, when .NET came out, I wasn't a fan because I was a C++ guy, and you weren't going to take my pointers away, and you just weren't. I was like, why would you give up that control? Right. That doesn't make any sense. And it took actually a developmental course years ago to sort of talk me out of it. And then I was sort of it. But I find that developers tend to get stuck in these sort of fear spaces, right? I know this really well, and if I go to the new thing, I'll be the new guy with that. And
right.
So it's not always, even, we're all really bright. Sure, but it doesn't mean we don't have, these emotional things that sort of box us in at times technologically.
Yes, and that's I see quite a bit of that. You see it outside too, but
sure.
Other things is you've realized, before you go to a big company like Microsoft or Apple or Google, a celebrity company is kind of how I put them. And you think, you see all these cool things happening, and you see it from a different perspective on the outside, even if you are an MVP who they let you have more information about goings on.
Sure.
And then you find out that while there are so many just genius, smart people there, it's not everybody. And, I was like, and they too make interestingly regular people mistakes. Yeah. And so it's kind of weird when you go in and you kind of have everything up on a pedestal a little bit more, and then that gets knocked down quickly. So some of the people, I'd be like, oh, wow, really?
How did you get hired?
Hey.
Yeah.
How did you get hired? That happened once or twice. I was like, oh my. And
did you want to mention their names on the air so that
no, not at all.
Burn those bridges completely? Okay, good. Yeah. That's the right call. I just I like to let people make the decision themselves.
Yeah. But the thing is, it's they're people. That's why, right? Because we're all humans, and not everybody's going to be good at the same thing, or all that. So,
do you think that because you started in software development, sort of the have to just get it done, and you were thrown into it really very young, that it's changed the way that you think about software, you think about a project, or you think about consulting you're doing for a company? Do you sometimes fear that some of that more formal training that we think of as something we get from a diploma is missing?
Yeah, I have thought about that before, and that's why well, two things. One is that I think, like, even if you do get a formal degree, if your education stops there, then I don't know, should you call yourself educated?
Sure.
And then the other one is, we do know that we can and do have successful people who don't have the formal education. And there are plenty of, especially now, 2014, there are plenty of venues to get yourself that kind of training.
Absolutely. Also,
asking your peers and getting feedback from your peers is another way of, like, hey, do I solve these problems? Is there something you with a degree might see that I don't, or, all these other things. And that's also why I wanted to take the course first, so that I could kind of get those out of the way.
Sure.
And then have as much of that kind of training as I can by the time I was going to run out of money. So there was that. But some of the stuff I like, if you look at data structures, things like that, sure, that all still works exactly the same now. But if I'm making, like, say, a Windows Store app, or even a Windows Forms app or something like that, you can drag and drop and have stuff connect to data. So is some of that even applicable? Well, under the hood somewhere it is, but for most intents and purposes, probably not. So, like, a lot of the stuff back then, even if it's still, buried under layers and layers of abstraction, it's still happening. Most people, for the most part, can live a developer life and not even know about it. So there's that.
Yeah, it doesn't affect you sort of on the same level where, you were starting with the main loop for a Windows app or anything like that.
Right. So, like, those things that I would have learned in ComSci way back when would have actually been much more, and they were much more applicable back then than they are now, because we've abstracted all that away with, general purposes and 4GL languages and things like that.
Absolutely.
It is nice to know it, though, to know that background stuff that's there. But that's,
I think it's
what
important.
You have to do is balance that.
Well, it's been great.
So I try to make sure that, sorry, I'm talking over you again. So I try to make sure that I am not missing those pieces, and then I'm filling in those holes. And then, it's not just stuff from a lack of a degree, right? Things because, maybe some concept or some things out there that I could be using that's not, like, say, unit testing or some kind of Scrum or Agile process or something like that. There are these new things that I'm sure they're teaching in ComSci now, right? And
you would hope.
Yeah, I would hope, right? So those kind of things, I try to make sure that I'm not missing anything that I should be, or that I might have from not having a formal education.
That makes sense. Well, it's been a delight having you on the show. I really admire, sort of where you came from, and then, of course, running into you everywhere. Seems like we always end up at the same conferences. I've never thought of you as anyone that fear stopped you doing anything. So I'm happy to have heard that that's absolutely the truth.
Well, thanks for having me, Sean.
You're very welcome. So enjoy the almost, or maybe